I think I'll kick it off, if I can, Bishop, and just ask you if you could give us your definition of religious freedom.
Religious freedom is the most fundamental of the freedoms because it has to do with our orientation toward what's of ultimate value. So it's as John Paul II said, it's not license to do what we want, but it's the right to do as we ought. So religious liberty is my positive relationship to that ultimate value. And I think therefore it belongs to the very heart of a democratic polity, which seeks to respect the integrity of the individual. But I guess I'd use John Paul II's definition if you want. It's the right to do as I ought, which I think belongs to the very heart of the project.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of the rise of new technologies, biotechnology in particular, things like genetic adaptation and stem cell research and all these sort of things, and how that sort of intersects with the cause of religious freedom?
Yeah, I would say this from a religious standpoint, we love the sciences, we love the evolution of the sciences and to allow them free reign as much as possible, but the sciences have to be reined in by some kind of moral constraint and a moral vision. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do it. And I think the religions bring to bear in their own way these deep moral concerns about the integrity of the individual, about human dignity. And so if a scientific advance is possible, it doesn't mean we necessarily should take it if it compromises human dignity. And I think allowing religions to express themselves within a democratic polity is essential, lest we fall into a sort of moral chaos. Something that concerns me a lot in my evangelical work, and you see it in young people all the time, is scientism. So the reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. It's a hyper-valorizing of the sciences. If the sciences say it, the scientists can do it, it's a good thing. And I think the religions especially can rise up to say, not necessarily. We love the sciences within their proper sphere, but we got to bring a moral and ultimately spiritual perspective to these questions. So that's where I would see religious liberty, letting the religions flourish within our polity, as essential to this question.
Can you maybe just touch on, we're in a year and a half into this global pandemic that's had a large impact on the ability of religious congregations to come together, to meet, to worship as they choose. But we've also seen churches, different religious persuasions opine one way or the other on the vaccine and that kind of thing. Can you maybe just talk about the pandemic and what the role of the church with a small c and with a capital C has been during the pandemic?
Yeah, we wrestle with it. I speak now as a bishop out here in California. We met on a regular basis during the pandemic to address just these issues. And from the beginning, we recognize this is a major public health challenge. We acquiesced, and I don't mean that in some subservient way. We agreed with the need to, close our churches and to put severe restrictions, and out of concern for people's health and well-being. So we were in complete agreement with that. We didn't, I say we here now, the bishops of California, I think the bishops of the United States, widely speaking, we didn't hold to that view of, there's such a complete freedom to the individual that we can resist all that. Deep in the Catholic tradition is a concern for the common good. And we saw that as basic as this thing got underway, and that we wanted to close our churches and to limit people's participation out of concern for the common good. Now, as the pandemic has unfolded, as the numbers have gone up and down, I understand how that debate gets a little more roiled, as people say, well, maybe it's time for us to allow greater. And we got into those debates too. And we pressed our government officials out here in California to allow greater and greater access as the numbers fluctuated. But we were responding, I think, with good prudential judgment to the changing, situation. Now there's, the churches have been opened. Most have some kind of restrictions still in place, whether masking or social distancing. So, I think, to give just our example, we tried to monitor the thing prudentially, concerned about the common good, but also concerned about people's right to worship. California, as you know, kind of led the charge in some ways there when people here pressed the Supreme Court ultimately to make a decision. So, we were in that debate, and I understand both sides of it. And there's not I think a definitive answer on either side. Rather, prudential judgment has to come into play, looking at individual liberty versus the common good. So I guess I'd situate it in that framework.
Do people of faith have an obligation to take a vaccine, or where does the church, where do you come down on that?
We've tended to use the language of the common good in regard. I think all Americans sort of balk whenever you talk about mandates and mandates coming from the government. On the other hand, look, there's all kinds of vaccines, polio and so on, that are mandated, and that our Catholic schools require parents to have their children vaccinated. So I think what we're tending toward, at least in California, is that we're going to follow the same kind of prescription that we followed with these other vaccinations, out of concern for the common good. So there's a legitimate, call it individualism, but if that gets hyper stressed, then we lose the common good, which is fundamental to Catholic social teaching.
And maybe one last one for me before I turn it
Please.
over to Chris. How do people of faith balance their commitment to the divine with their obligations in a democratic society if there's a conflict?
Well, if there's an ultimate conflict, you've always got to go with God. So go up and down the centuries, the supreme example would be martyrdom. A martyr would say, no, I have to stand with God over and against the state that's making demands upon me. Can a democratic polity become oppressive to religious people? Sure. I mean, de Tocqueville saw that a long time ago. So that's always a danger or a possibility. And if push comes to shove, you have to stand with the Lord, of course. But, I'd sort of stand with Thomas More. More, when push ultimately came to shove, said, I stand with God, not with the king. But he spent a long time trying to prudentially adjudicate that relationship and to find a path through that thicket. And I think that's okay. I think we should do our work carefully and prudentially. At the end of the day, you have to opt for God, of course. And if the state becomes antagonistic to that purpose, then it has to be resisted. But I don't think we usually or typically come to that point. And I think we can find all sorts of ways within a prudential framework to make our way.
Bishop, let me shift away from the vaccine questions. I
Sure.
think not just for the moment, but for the rest of this interview. You've done a lot of work on the nuns, and obviously I know they're non-religiously affiliated.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, with respect to religious freedom, what effect does that growing population of the nuns, of the religiously unaffiliated, have on religious freedom, both in our country and supporting it around the world?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's got a lot of, I think, aspects to it. One is just as religion more and more is sort of fading away from people's consciousness. And if it's true that 40% of young people under 30 now claim no religious affiliation, the fear is that as we move forward, religion itself will more and more fade away. And then people will be less and less concerned for its integrity. That worries me a lot. If religion is not even a serious player in the arena, people say, well, why bother with it? Why bother with its concerns? Up to this point, heck, when I was a kid, early 70s, 97% of our country would have claimed a religious heritage, which meant they took religion seriously. I thought it was an important element of the society. If it becomes more and more irrelevant to the society, that's a very serious concern. And then, something will always fill that vacuum. There's an ideological vacuum as religion retreats, and as I would say, a secularism with all sorts of moral features, as that moves into the vacated space, then there is a real danger to religion and to religious liberty. See, and the other problem is, and I see it all the time with young people, number one thing that's bugging young people, let's say Catholics, Christians under 30, under 40, is the attitudes in regard to sex. So our attitudes toward gay people, toward transgender people, toward gay marriage. And there's a very clear moral perspective that accompanies this rising secularism. And it's basically a moral perspective of live and let live, allow complete sexual freedom. Well, that is moving more and more into the space evacuated by religion. And religion is being seen increasingly as a problem. Not just a neutral, nice private hobby that some people have, but the chief rival to this moral vision of complete sexual liberty. So that worries me a lot too, in regard to the nuns.
Absolutely. And especially, I think I'd love to hear your perspective. I think you're often called the social media bishop. So I think, especially given your work to engage people, to talk about different ideas, to enter into civil and reasoned dialogue, I'm curious about why that is so important. I think you talked about this in your book, Arguing Religion, but why is that so important, especially in a democratic society, to fostering religious freedom?
Absolutely. What I've argued is more and more the art and science of formulating arguments. We have these two extremes that are just automatically present in people's minds. On the one hand is a violent imposition of one's belief. On the other hand is a bland toleration. And see, I say a plague on both your houses. Neither one of those moves us toward truth and goodness and beauty. What's in between bland toleration on the one hand and a violent imposition on the other is real argument. So the marshaling of evidence, the paying close attention to the data, the formulation of syllogisms, the drawing of conclusions, the testing of one's conclusions, entering into civil dialogue with those who disagree, all those disciplines that Thomas Aquinas knew. You know, I hearken back to the Middle Ages, those great disputed questions. Thomas is one of the great arguers of the Western tradition. Go all the way back to Plato. Look at the Socratic dialogues or forms of argumentation. We're losing that art. We're losing that science. And all we got left is, look, I'm going to shout you down, or I'm going to just blandly tolerate everything. Neither one of those gets us anywhere. And both are bad for a democracy, because I think a democracy is founded upon a keen sense of argument. Now call it political argument. So not violent imposition, not bland toleration, but real engagement of issues in a civil way and following the rules of effective argumentation. I think those things are essential to a flourishing democracy.
Let me try and tie all these elements together in terms of religious freedom and democracy. Yeah. What is this connection between religious freedom and democratic stability? How do they reinforce one another?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. Look at our system. We take so for granted basic human equality, and it's a major value for people today. Where does equality come from? You know, I used to teach political philosophy, and you read the ancient political philosophers. Equality? Are you kidding? People aren't equal. In Plato and Aristotle, in fact, their political views are predicated upon the assumption that people are not equal. So Plato's got the three divisions of society. Aristotle says a tiny handful of elites are the ones who govern society. The rest should do what they're told or stay within the household or stay as slaves. Equality was by no means self-evident to the ancient figures, Cicero and so on. Why could Thomas Jefferson say that all people, it's self-evident that all people are equal, and it's that little tiny word that we run over, created. All men are created equal. We're not equal in beauty or skill or moral virtue or anything else. We're radically unequal. And the classical philosophers recognize that. The best and brightest ought to be the rulers of society, aristocracy, etc. But something happened in between Plato and Thomas Jefferson, and it was precisely Christian revelation. All men are created equal. I think you put God out of the picture, the equality of people will follow close behind. We will no longer appreciate their equality. The same thing with human rights. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Plato and Aristotle never thought everyone had inalienable rights. They thought a few in the social elite had rights, and maybe the other people might be granted prerogatives by the condescension of the state. Look at contemporary atheist systems. By no means does everyone have human rights. Where do they come from? I would argue Jefferson gave away the game. You know, they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. See, I want religion to be active and operative within our society because I care for our democracy. And if religion is more and more marginalized, then the very foundations of our democracy in rights and in freedom is going to be compromised. That's my fundamental fear. Is it should not be something that is granted, you know, by the state in a sovereign way that will tolerate you, a kind of oddball religious people, to have your little hobby. No. What we articulate belongs to the very foundations of a healthy democracy. And so I would tremble for our system if religion is, as it's becoming, more and more marginalized.
Now, let me close with a softball question for you. given all this, how do policymakers, especially in a pluralistic democracy, try to bring different groups together to make policy for different groups that seem to be in opposition together, whether that be a religious community, a gender equality community, LGBTQ community? How do you legislate for all of these different groups that, at least superficially, seem to be at odds?
That's a softball question.
I was just joking.
No, but you know what I would say is this: within the Catholic tradition that I come out of, we would have what's called the philosophy of the natural law, and the natural law is religious in the measure that it participates in the providence of God. So we would recognize certain moral values that are inherent in the very structure of reality. They come ultimately from God, who is the source of all meaning, intelligibility, and value. Just as the intelligibilities explored by the sciences come from God, so the moral intelligibilities explored by ethicists come from God. So to that degree, they're religious. On the other hand, they're not so peculiarly tied to Christian revelation that they can't be accessed by a wide variety of people. So I would say when making public argument, I'd follow John Courtney Murray, the great Jesuit theoretician, who would say, let's appeal to our own natural law tradition, which should appeal to all people of good mind and goodwill. It's religious indeed, because it's coming ultimately from God, and it's grounded in values that are outside of simply the decisions of individuals. There's something objective about it. At the same time, it's not so peculiar and sectarian that other people couldn't participate in them. So I would propose the natural law and the great principles of it as a foundation for our moral conversation. I think the problem is so often the almost exclusive moral principle that's used today is self-expression, that I have a right to express myself any way I want to. I call it the culture of self-invention. Well, natural law does indeed stand athwart that, because it holds to these objective moral intelligibilities that are meant to govern my subjectivity and direct my subjectivity. It's not simply up to me to determine what's good and what's true. I should be in a relationship of openness to the objective realm. Anyway, I would propose that as a framework maybe for having a common conversation about these values.